D&D is a Western. It's a controversial statement, but I firmly believe it. Here's why Dungeons & Dragons game world works best not as a pseudo-medieval European fantasy, but as an analogue to the American West. Previously, I've posited a magical industrial revolution as the logical consequence of the game's rules. But I will admit, to reinforce that setting, you do require a large focus to be drawn on urban environments. And the system of D&D isn't necessarily best suited to this. Historically, survivalism, the wilderness, and delving into old ruins and caves are part of the game's exploration loop. After all, in every disappointing iteration, the Ranger class does seem built to fulfill that gameplay loop. So why, suddenly, am I advocating for this Wild West as a premier, logical, reasonable outgoing of D&D's rules? Have I changed my mind? Have I moved away from the Industrial Revolution? Well, not necessarily. Let's look at some of the key features of the American frontier and compare it to how D&D presents a world. For starters, let's look at how people act. In almost all D&D worlds, we have a class of people who could not exist within a traditional feudal system. Adventurers. These people do not stay in one place, they do not pay rents to a certain landlord, and they do not swear fealty to a lord's banners, necessarily. Adventurers are almost always self-directed mercenary types who roam untamed lands. On a broader social scale, D&D's base assumptions seem to concern free trade, commerce, and much of the setting is permeated by Enlightenment-style ideas and technological prowess that is far beyond what we would traditionally expect out of, the Middle Ages, whatever the hell they were. Absolute monarchy makes far less sense when the monarch is nowhere near the best fighter, or strategist, or magic user, even among humanoids in his own kingdom. Not to mention all of the monsters that roam around. This is a world where individual liberty is really quite significant. It couldn't not be, considering the massive lifespans of creatures like elves. With such long and absurdly long lives, it would be utterly shocking for an elf to be deprived of their liberty for half of their life. That's 350 years, that's 3 lifetimes at least for a regular person. It takes an awful lot of world building work to justify every powerful mage in the country ceding their authority to some absolute monarch. But a frontier style setting where the monarch's concerns are far, far different to the concerns of the people on the ground, and there's a very tenuous relationship between law and order in the frontier and law and order back home, that is one of the ways it can be justified. Take the monarch as far out of the picture as possible. Funnily enough, a place without a traditional authority figure already in place is actually ripe for D&D styled adventure. In our world's history, the American West was among the last untamed wilds, unless of course you're counting the native population. But in a world that is permeated by massive, terrifying threats that shape ecologies around entire sections of the world, we're looking at probably having far more untamed wilds in our D&D worlds, even if we take a medieval perspective on the whole thing. You're going to have a far harder time scouting and maintaining land claims when you're not just opposing other humanoid forces, but also dragons, beholders, giants, and devils. It is my view that with the magic available in base D&D, we're going to see pockets of hyper-specialised, hyper-optimised civilization dotting various points around the globe, with farmland stretching out beyond them and then wilderness beyond that. This model is chiefly due to a couple of spells, Teleportation Circle and Plant Growth, two of the most powerful spells in the game, which I already have videos on their world building implications. Essentially, we get really wealthy pockets dotted around with satellite towns, surrounded by circular fields producing twice the yields that one would normally expect. The main point though is that with the technological and agricultural revolutions that would be engendered by these two spells, we end up with a lot of the world being wilderness, unprotected and unprotectable by most civilized nations. Wilderness which is occasionally broken up by a high concentration urban centre. But who's going to be responsible for guarding, policing and ensuring the safety of those livestock and farms at the very edge of known civilization? Cowboys? Vaqueros? Adventurers? Especially when threats to livestock and farming are as dangerous and varied as orcs, minotaurs, rust monsters, dragons, and fey folk. You're going to need specialists, monster slayers, paid by land barons and townships dotted around this frontier border, ready to take on whatever quest gets thrown their way. But now let's look in the other direction. What are the defining features of Western as a historical period and indeed a genre in pop culture? First off, the period depicting in the Western genre lasted a remarkably short time. The Western frontier closed officially in 1890 when the US Census Bureau decided that there was no unsettled frontier land still left in the American West. Of course, there are still land grabs, sheriffs, stagecoach robberies, and gunslingers well into the 20th century and indeed beyond. But primarily, the period we're looking at lasts somewhere between 30 and 50 years, taking us from the 1840s, 50s to essentially the turn of the century. But what were the key features and developments of this period? What defined the American Western frontier? The pioneering of telegraphs, the widespread use of firearms as a reliable primary weapon across the populace, the establishment of trains and train lines to revolutionise the transport of people, goods and livestock, immense tensions with native peoples, a rush for valuable precious materials, and electricity revolutionising how society as a whole functions. Let's go in reverse and compare each of these to a D&D styled world. Technology certainly makes digging, alarms, livestock handling, mechanisation and refrigeration much easier, especially if we replace electricity as a driving factor with first level spells and cantrips in D&D. Much of what electricity does to make lives easier and or bearable in this horrific dry dust bowl of a frontier in the American West can be done through magic. Magic is analogous to electricity in this case. Prestidigitation can be used to cool down food or potentially refrigerate it with things like frostbolt. Mold Earth allows grand swaths of construction to happen en masse. Mending might help supplant the sewing machine, for example. And light, as a cantrip, can allow for grand towns to be powered all night long and actually have some light so that the people can do things out after long days in the sun. In addition, there would almost certainly be a rush for rare materials out on a D&D frontier, especially if the city, the urban centre, has exhausted most of the land around it of natural resources. Part of what the frontier offers are monster bits, which are used in crafting magic items of all different varieties. In fact, the rarer the monster slain, the better. But part of this rush will be for gold and indeed gems. Gems which have a massive outsized impact on the economy and function of a D&D styled world more generally. A fact that I might need to talk about in a future video. Regarding tensions with the native peoples who are already there, we can go a few ways with this. One of them is definitely more sensitive to the plight of the Native American peoples. The more sensitive approach is to portray this new frontier as already occupied by native peoples with their own extant culture. Perhaps ancient elven civilizations out in the wilderness, or other kind of non-human cultures are around. Perhaps they're trying to hold off the spread of this huge ranch-like farming project spreading out from an urban centre, hold that out of their ancestral lands, or perhaps they just don't like the expansionists or the colonists very much. Or even, if they're elves, say they seek to negotiate in long, drawn-out councils for every inch of land that is to be taken, which does not suit the timeline of a rapidly expanding urban industrial environment, just that is putting pressure on this frontier to expand and expand and expand. These situations would well mirror the plight of the indigenous people in the American West, and indeed native peoples the world over. We could also use this opportunity to reframe some of the traditional enemies in D&D as people with legitimate quarrels with the vast terraforming and change of land use, perhaps, or the expansion of this civilization from beyond their shores. They might have qualms with the destruction of natural environments, or indeed the rampant sweeping colonizing of what would likely be a coalition of men and gnomes, possibly with some dwarven profiteers and oligarchs sitting backing the whole project in the background. Druids, nature priests, and shamans more generally may be among those opposed to the expansion, as well as nomadic tribes and things of that description as well. Alternatively, a riskier and perhaps less sensitive approach is to use monsters as stand-ins for this native land struggle instead. Perhaps orcs, as described in my orc video, as Persian-styled warrior nomads with an affinity for hunting with birds of prey, which they can zoom into as familiars. These guys might serve as a brilliant dramatic foil for an expansionist frontier to come up against. Might be an excellent enemy for a group of adventurers to find while they are seeking their own little parcel of land on the frontier, as long as we're not reinforcing those tired old stereotypes of the native peoples being somehow lesser, or indeed some form of noble savage. In my opinion, mixing these approaches leads to the coolest outcome. In my worlds, I use a variety of creatures, from those with significant cultural roots like orcs and elves, to more brutal territorialists like manticores, to demonstrate the myriad threats and claims to the land of a frontier. Of course, another great threat is also other people. But this all ties into the fact that, like with the American frontier, and very much like with every single presentation I have ever seen of Dungeons & Dragons, whatever wild wilderness, whatever untamed lands our adventurers wander into, there's always someone who's been there first. Another thing that aligns our understandings of the American West to a D&D style world is the power and reliance on mass transit, mass transportation, to get goods from one disparate location to the next. Trains were critical infrastructure, allowing the transport of goods, people and livestock across vast swaths of really unpleasant, inhospitable land. And during the construction and maintenance of the railroads, many people were employed, were required to be employed, often, yes, in horrible conditions. Yet it's very rare to find trains represented in D&D worlds. Well, that's because we have Teleportation Circle, which kind of does the same thing. It takes goods from one isolated area to another isolated area, through or across, or indeed in this case bypassing, a bunch of difficult terrain in the centre. Except teleportation circles work without the need to lay tracks across the entire way. Instead, it's a long process of casting the spell over and over again in the destination. In terms of making a whole bunch of different goods providers gather in one place and put all their goods in one machine, as it were, to transport it from point A to point B, trains are really quite well analogous to teleportation circles. Please do check out the entire video I made on the impact aspects politically of Teleportation Circle if you want more of a deep dive into how that all works. Suffice it to say, the Great Teleportation Robbery sounds pretty flippin' awesome to me. Just to step out of order for a little second, the telegraph system, which is set up and is in use by the time of the peak of the Wild West, sounds an awful lot like the sending spell in D&D, to me. Limited amounts of word and bandwidth to be sent using great resource across grand distances from the frontier all the way back to civilization very quickly. Sending is a telegraph network without the need to actually build the poles and the wires. This helps us establish our frontiers simply just a bit faster, in full working Wild West style, without the need to invest millions and millions of pounds or dollars or of gold pieces into establishing these networks beforehand. We can have a frontier ongoing the moment civilization decides that's a good idea. You see, in my view, considering the magic that is available in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and the impact that this would have on society, I think we can look to emulate a technological level of roughly the turn of the century, if not higher in certain aspects of life, with the potential of also areas having some very little magical development and magical technological development, and areas of society in a more broad sense where magic can't keep up with technology. It's also a very fair point that there are some things that magic in 5e cannot do. For example, we may not see magical vaccinations or inoculations develop, considering that the ability to cure any disease is pretty simple amongst 5e's rule system. There may be significant gulfs in the mass conveyancing of healthcare to people in a preventative style. Now, I should probably address the elephant in the room. Guns. In our D&D styled fantasy, our primary weapons of choice are not usually rifles and revolvers. Bows, swords, great axes and the like are not commonly seen in the Western genre. Maybe the odd cavalry saber, lasso or whip, and maybe a bow in the hands of the Native Americans, for example, but that might be the limit. So what's the solution to this problem? Well, it's really quite a tough one. Many classes only get simple weapon proficiency, which doesn't tend to include firearms. Of course, I would recommend in a setting like this maybe a house rule for that. But then again, firearms are an optional item anyway. They don't always get included in a system, and indeed the firearms in 5e are very much early firearms. By this point, firearms technology has been developed quite significantly, and so they are outranging anything at this point. Flavour could work. A great axe may end up being a large broad-headed shovel. A pike, a railway spike perhaps. And it is true that some outlaws in the American West did wear breastplates under their clothes to try and make them more resilient to being shot and killed. And the outlaw Ned Kelly famously wore an entire suit of metal armour to protect himself from being shot. Although, to be fair, he was not in the American West, he was an Australian. This may be the weakest point of my whole argument in this video, but I would possibly say that you don't need to include firearms in a setting like this. If you're looking for a weapon that can unerringly finish off any regular man within 120 feet, Magic Missile is your best bet in D&D. If you'd like to match the effective range of a revolver at this period, at about 300 feet, all you need is Eldritch Blast and the Eldritch Spear Invocation, or the Spell Sniper feat. Now, it is true that unless you're an incredibly specialised, optimised character build, you're not going to be rivaling the effective range of a rifle from this period. But it is a good point that offensive magic is a fairly decent analogue for how powerful the firearm was in the hands of the common man. Whether you choose to use firearms in this kind of setting or not, one thing is for sure, magic fundamentally shifts how combat works, not least due to the myriad different types of creatures that might be found in this kind of place. In any case, if we're sticking to the balance of 5th edition as our guideline, I would hesitate to say that any single melee option is more effective than a ranged weapon, or magic. Shooting at a dangerous enemy will almost always supersede running up and stabbing them. This is also a cultural similarity between D&D and the Wild West. Finally, there's a simple aesthetic point. From a storytelling point of view, the Western genre seems to lend itself perfectly to the tale of a small band of adventurers making their way through the wilderness, fighting corruption, bandits, getting revenge, enforcing the law, or breaking it in a heist, prison escape, or raid. Maybe even they delve deep into the old mine despite the local residents all telling them it's haunted. Folks roaming around from adventure to adventure, right on the limits of where vast ranched farmed lands turn into untracked wilderness. Stopping off in every town's saloon to try and find the shadiest looking fellas, to hear the rumours of the land. Rumours of monsters, devil worshippers, magic mountain men, skinwalkers, and ghosts. And maybe our intrepid band of brothers may end up going on a series of episodic adventures to fix all of these problems on the dangerous, wild frontier. That sounds an awful lot like D&D to me. I hope I've convinced you that this interpretation of D&D's setting priorities and the world-building implications of it do have some links to the Western genre and maybe have convinced you to try it out yourself. Please do let me know if you've tried this. In my experience, it works best on the very, very outskirts of the farms, far beyond, away from one of these urbanized mega metropolis sort of magical hubs, as it were. But do let me know if you find any other way to justify putting a frontier into your game. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.